Welcome back to every naval battle in history. I've got to come clean for a small mistake with this series in the last episode. My big list of naval battles had Arginusae before Notium, which is a big mistake on the list compiler's part. But I didn't pick up on it, so here we are. For most of the viewers through the life of this series on YouTube, it will only mean some slight strangeness in how I introduce Lysander more fully in the next episode. For the beloved few who've been following the series from the start, my apologies. Let's go back in time 6 months from where we left off last week. And with that out of the way, let's talk about the Battle of Notium, where Alcibiades' story ends and Lysander's begins. It's the same old story of the late Peloponnesian War. Athens is mortally wounded but doesn't know how to give up, and is so self-absorbed in its own internal conflicts it can barely register as its allies peel away and its enemies grow their forces. Still, desperate Athenian admirals find increasingly ingenious ways to keep the grain ships from the Black Sea feeding Athens as the residents hunker down behind the long walls decade after decade, watching the Spartans burn their fields every summer. Lysander, the Spartan up-and-comer, the outsider to Spartan society, was building a fleet with rivers of gold provided by the Persian prince Cyrus. Lysander offered so much pay to experienced rowers that the Athenian sailors started deserting to row for Sparta. Lysander had set up a fleet base at Ephesus, very close to the Athenian stronghold of Samos. The brilliant but unreliable Alcibiades had brought a superior fleet to Notium, just a few kilometres north along the coast. Lysander was not ready or willing to take on the legend of Alcibiades in a straight fight and refused to come out of port. The deadlock was ended when Alcibiades sailed north with troops to help his friend Thrasybulus besiege Phaeacia. He left the fleet in command of his helmsman Antiochus. Now, in the modern era, it's unthinkable for an admiral to leave the fleet in the hands of a bosun, but the whole structure was different then. Also, it's easy to see why he didn't bother appointing a serious succession plan, as his only order to Antiochus was, "Do not attack Lysander's ships." Antiochus thought this was his big chance to make a name for himself, and he'd been very impressed with the way Alcibiades, Thrasybulus and Theramenes had used a portion of their fleet to lure the Spartans to disaster at Cyzicus. Episode 19 if you haven't seen it yet. So he set off with a small force of 10 triremes to try and lure Lysander out where the rest of the Athenian fleet could crush him. It turns out Antiochus was no Alcibiades. His ship was sunk early, and he was killed. The remaining 9 triremes were chased back to Notium, where the main body of the fleet was not ready for battle, and at the end of the day 15 ships were captured by the Spartans and 7 more were sunk. Alcibiades was blamed for the mess and would never command Athenian forces again, retreating to his personal estates at modern-day Gallipoli. Thrasybulus and Theramenes' careers were also ended, to the great cost of Athens, which had desperate need of their abilities. For the Spartans, it was a much-needed victory at sea, and a vindication to Cyrus that the rivers of gold he was directing to them were paying off. It's a fascinating point of counterfactual. If Antiochus had done what he was told and stayed in harbour, if Alcibiades had not gallivanted off from his command, things would have been different. Strap in, folks, we've got a lot more to cover as we take on every naval battle in history. Smash those like and subscribe buttons, you don't want to get left behind.